with the upcoming Scream 7 movie now on the horizon, with Matthew Lillard having to confirm the return of Stu Macher within this upcoming Scream movie, there are many fans within the horror and Scream fandom that are seemingly begging the question as to what exactly is Stu Macher's character role going to be in this upcoming Scream movie, with the overall potential for his upcoming character having to now seemingly be limitless with what they could ultimately end up doing with the character of Stu Macher. I think I ultimately speak on behalf of everybody that is listening and watching this video when I say that we don't want to see a repeat of Jamie Lee Curtis's fight, Jamie Lee Curtis's portrayal as Laurie Strode up against Michael Myers from what we've seen go down in Halloween Ends. And I only say that to say that that was one of the most underwhelming fights, especially with the overall build-up for their upcoming quote final battle having to be very, very big and easily spanning over 4 decades of having their interactions be having to stem from the original first movie all the way up until the very point of Halloween Ends. As I say that to prove the point by saying that I hope that we don't end up seeing something similar go down involving Stu and Sidney in this upcoming film, in assuming that they are going to fight to begin with, because if we are going to see Stu Macher's Ghostface go at it against Sidney in this upcoming movie, I definitely speak on behalf of many when I say that this should be a very barbaric and drawn out fight for the two in this upcoming movie, because not only does Stu and Sidney have a very rich history that stems all the way back to the very first and original Scream movie, but in order for the overall story to feel rich in the sense of either having Stu win or even having Sidney prevail by the very end and having to take down Stu for good, the overall dynamic and the overall battle between those two needs to be very well executed, because if they end up cutting corners and they end up kind of cutting things short in not delivering in the overall idea that they've kept Stu alive this entire time only for him to return in Scream 7, then not only will the overall build-up and the reward by the end of this film feel very underrated and underwhelming in a sense where we could have gotten something more than what we expected, but instead we ended up getting less. So unless they either plan on having maybe Stu survive somehow by the end of this fight, which will ultimately carry into maybe perhaps potentially Scream 8 and beyond, then they should go as far as to deliver in giving us one of the best horror fights I think in any other franchise that we've ever seen be done before with the characters of Sid and Stu, which is why it is ultimately very important to reveal, since everybody now knows that Matthew Lillard's character is going to be returning for this movie, that Stu ends up being a force to be reckoned with in this film, because you don't want to have the same Stu be portrayed by the events of the first movie and having him be goofy or having him kind of be silly in a sense, but instead you want to go as far as to introduce a different element to his character, a more unpredictable, a more sinister, a more violent, and a more ruthless side to his character than before, which on top of the fact you also want to go as far as to have Scream 7 feel different than Scream 1, feel different than Scream 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I do believe that they're going to have to provide us with additional context clues to allow for us to assume that the story is going to go in one direction, but instead it actually ends up taking a completely different direction by the very end of the overall movie by giving us something completely different and something better than what we thought we would end up seeing, which now begs the question, with so many characters and so many returning legacy characters having to be confirmed to be in this upcoming movie, then the question becomes as to what exactly do they have planned for secondary ghost faces, including those that might be doppelgangers, to kind of allow for us to think, oh, okay, so these guys are the killers, but it turns out that they're really working or kind of playing into a bigger hand, which could inevitably turn out for them to be taking orders by Stu Macher and having Stu Macher kind of call the shots in delivering what these ghost faces should end up following, in having to listen to every word he says and having to kind of perhaps maybe pigeonhole Sidney into a scenario or situation that Stu wants for her to be in up until he ends up revealing himself. So what I think that we should end up looking forward to in this upcoming movie is Sidney having to be alone this time around, and I think that would be a very important element to her character, because we knew that in the past she was always surrounded by Dewey. He's no longer around. Of course, there is still Gale, in which you could end up kind of offing her in this movie if you want to prolong this series, but that's neither here or there, depending on if you want to see perhaps Gale kind of outlive Sidney, which I don't think that a lot of people do want to see, which is why I believe that if they went as far as to off Dewey's character in the past, then they should end up doing that with Gale before Sidney. So maybe, just maybe, to add more depth and more overall richness to this story, Stu should end up being the one that kind of destroys and ruins Sidney's life that much more by having to be the one that offs Gale by the the end of the movie, perhaps even maybe going as far as to get away. As I say that to say that you don't want to have Stu's character return only for him to get fodderized by the very end by the hands of Sidney and company, because you can't really have a great story with a protagonist if you don't have a better antagonist that carries the film, right? And without the Carpenter sisters being involved, which something tells me maybe, just maybe, we might get a mention of them, or perhaps maybe something that subverts expectations is seeing these characters in the film, which I highly doubt due to all the recent political discourse that has occurred throughout, you know, the last couple of years involving things that have been happening overseas. It would have been really great to see the Carpenter sisters be involved to some capacity, because they were heavily featured and of course were the backbone of the Scream franchise for an entire 2 films. Having to now move and go into Scream 7, you kind of have to go as far as to mention them or even possibly have some involvement with them, because if you don't end up doing that, then the canon gets messed up, because if you don't recall the events of what has happened in Scream 5 and Scream 6 going into Scream 7, then what is really the point at that given point in time to see Sidney kind of live out her life if she isn't already aware or at least kind of wary on the events that have happened prior in both Scream 5 and Scream 6, right? So if it inevitably turns out that Stu Macher was behind maybe a brand new cult that worships the legacy of the Ghostfaces, or maybe perhaps he ends up becoming a cult leader too, inspiring people that want to be just like how, you know, he inevitably came up as being one of the original Ghostfaces that hunted down Sidney. These elements and these concepts I think would be very important, because thus far we know that in a small kind of way Sid is a kind of sort of maybe like a Mary Sue in this franchise, because no matter what she ends up going through by the end of each movie, she somehow ends up surviving. She somehow ends up kind of continuing to tell her story in the future to some capacity, right? Which now only makes me wonder, as I'm sure many of you guys are probably wondering the same thing, and that is, number 1, how did Stu survive? Number 2, where has he been ever since the original first movie? And number 3, what exactly are his motives other than simply having to go after Sidney Prescott? Is it only going to be Sidney Prescott, or maybe does Stu Macher have a greater agenda? Maybe after Sidney Prescott is essentially buried into the ground, then does Stu have plans to go after the Carpenter sisters? Is there going to be any interest in going after the Carpenter sisters? Things of that nature I think are very important, and hopefully enough they end up expanding and explaining and kind of giving us more depth as to all of this and more, because with Stu having to be a legacy character, because some people have mentioned Roman in the past, of course, having to maybe do something with him coming up, or maybe even something maybe involving Stu's sister and family of that bloodline, having to bring them in the film. I think there are many things that can be done and are possible, but the one factor I think that needs to be executed very, very well is going to be that final fight involving Sidney and Stu, because you don't want to have a Halloween Ends kind of scenario take place. You don't want to have anything kind of be similar to that in a way, so hopefully they end up giving us something that is going to exceed our overall expectations and give us something worth watching, because if not, then we are simply at that point going to have another Halloween Ends situation on our hands, and I don't think that anybody wants to essentially see that in this upcoming Scream movie. So, but even now, by the very end of all of this, I want to go ahead and get your thoughts down in the comment section below about how you guys personally feel about the character of Stu Macher having to appear in Scream 7, and more importantly, is what are your overall expectations for this upcoming confrontation, for this upcoming story of Scream 7 that's going to be dropping assumingly sometime in 2026. As lastly, I also want to go ahead and get your thoughts on the overall direction of where you think the franchise is going to go after Scream 7. So again, I want to thank you all so much for watching, everybody. Thank you all so much for your time. To which, once more, if you also just so happen to be new to this channel and of course love Scream and horror, that I do encourage for you all to head on down below and smash that subscribe button, on top of making sure to give this video a big fat thumbs up by smashing that like button down below. Tune back in for more, and with all that being said, I want to thank you all so much for your time, and I'll be seeing you all down in the comment section below, and of course in the next video. Take it easy, everybody, and have a great day. Peace!